A great deal of time and debate has been dedicated to the question of whether violent media can be said to incite violent behavior. Entire court cases have been held seeking to answer this one question. And of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, entire swaths of violent media appreciators have retaliated against even asking that question in the first place. Personally speaking, until recently, I have been rather libertarian around such inquiries. I figured that in a fictional setting, actions taken by fictional characters would only, in the most extreme and mentally challenged minds, create a motivation to enact similar types of behavior. Basically, at least in mindset, I was no different from G-Fuel chugging gamers who will proclaim ad nauseum that violent video games don't cause real-world violence. Practically speaking, of course, I tend not to resemble that crowd. I don't play a whole lot of video games, and I beat even fewer of them. But again, at least until recently, I agreed with their mindset pretty uncritically. Then, over the last 2 weeks, I watched the John Wick movies, and suddenly I'm not so sure my approach to that question was worth so little examination on my part. Never have I felt more uncomfortable watching a series unfold than I have as I was watching the death count at the hand of Keanu Reeves steadily rise over the course of 3 movies, with likely more coming along. This isn't to say I didn't enjoy the time I had watching the trilogy, I did. These are incredibly well-made movies on a technical level. My issues with the films are mostly thematic. So like in academic criticism, there's this term called Ludonarrative Dissonance, used to refer to the sometimes completely opposed goals the narratives of usually violent video games have versus the actual process of playing the games. Errant Signal, when discussing this idea, draws upon Grand Theft Auto 4 to make his point, noticing the conflicting goals of the gameplay, which emphasizes the fun, chaotic nature of murder in a sprawling sandbox where shooting, running over, and stabbing people is really fun, while also insisting throughout its narrative, notably through cutscenes and NPC dialogue, that such actions are immoral. What does that have to do with John Wick? Well, at least speaking in the ludological sense, the films have nothing to do with the term, because of course they are cinema. However, in the sense of there being a jarring incongruity between what the movies are trying to say about the violent behavior perpetuated by its protagonist and the actual methods it chooses to portray that violence, I think there is something to be said about the narrative dissonance aspect of the term. When I watch John Wick, the violence looks awesome. Shooting sprees by our main character often take place in immaculately lit and very well mic'd settings, ensuring that every detail, be it visual or auditory, registers to the audience. When Mikey Newman talks about the first John Wick film, the foremost aspect he talks about is the production of it. Keanu Reeves did all of his own stunts. He did 4 months of jujitsu and active firearm training to make sure that the pursuit of such goals would add to the realism of the films. The trilogy was directed by a stunt double who knew the ins and outs of making action cinema, and his expertise in that aspect of filmmaking is obvious. I completely understand why critics would so easily gravitate towards such an obviously well-done aspect of this creation. It so rarely occurs to people to look at what action cinema uses to justify its violence because violence is part of the DNA of action cinema, so the main concern amongst the audience of those films is how well the violence unfolds. I, however, am not a frequent traveler in the land of brutality. I've certainly watched some savage shit before, I won't deny it, but I don't really seek it out. Because of this, I'm not surprised I'm the first to take issue with some of the creative decisions made in these movies. So what's the John Wick trilogy actually trying to say about violence? An easy way to answer this question is to look at how the film treats its protagonist throughout his bloodthirsty quest for vengeance. Catharsis is the bread and butter of the John Wick films, and each installment has to grapple with how to weigh the intensity of inciting incidents which lead to the ensuing bloodfests, and the intensity of the way the cinematic language portrays John's actions on screen. In Chapter 1, the impetus for this trilogy of slaughter comes in the way of some dickshit slimeball gangster boys coming up to Keanu Reeves, killing his dog that his wife gifted him immediately after she died, as well as stealing his car. In screenwriting circles, there's this terminology referred to as a kick the puppy moment, which is often used as a shorthanded method of portraying a certain party as evil beyond redemption. Only a monster would hurt an infant animal which has no means of protecting itself. The catharsis that arrives from discovering that the big bad chose the wrong guy to mess with is what fuels the engagement, at least in myself, with the movie's narrative structure. This is a personal anecdote, but I feel it may elucidate why, as far as the first film is concerned, I enjoyed it more than the other 2 movies which followed it. Whenever a family member close to us dies, be them either human or feline, my family has a bad habit of getting a new cat as a means of grieving. When my dad died, we got a flame lynx point Siamese named Shmuel to keep our mental states together while we process the death of a vital part of our everyday lives. When the black cat named Odessa we had adopted in the middle of Hurricane Sandy had to be put down months afterwards due to a feline infectious peritonitis, basically kitty coronavirus, within a week we had adopted an equally amicable black cat as a replacement. Meet Lila. So when John is gunning down the people responsible for the death of what he calls his means of mourning, you shouldn't be surprised that I'm rooting for him in his pursuits. When Mikey Newman discusses this trilogy, he keeps returning to the phrase, "you did this to yourself," or "you did this to you," describing the often brutal consequences John faces in response to his need to seemingly seek revenge for transgressions against his ego. Throughout the series of films, you see Mr. Wick being given multiple opportunities to escape this cycle of violence he's intensely dedicated to inflict on others, but he chooses not to. By Parabellum, the stubborn nature of his results in him losing the entire support network, which has aided him in the completion of his tasks throughout the first two movies, turning against him due to a command spurned by his own decision to break the rules cleanly laid bare in front of him. But at the end of the day, John's life may have been infinitely less stressful if when Big Bad killed his dog, he had just shrugged it off and done nothing. That's what Yosef and his gang set out to do in the first place, being unaware of the mythologies surrounding Mr. Wick. They figured the goal of stealing some uppity schmuck's car and the killing of his dog was nothing to worry about. What the hell is some rando rich white guy gonna do about it? Kill them? In fact, when Yosef is asked to justify his attempts to fuck with John, he cites the fact that he assumed stealing a car and killing a puppy was completely acceptable behavior for a criminal underling to engage in. And Yosef's father, Vigo, does nothing to dissuade his son from this mindset. The issue he takes is that in this one instance, Yosef picked the wrong target to prod for a reaction. By choosing to go back into the criminal underworld that he had actually managed to escape from at one point, John is now forced to handle the wrath of not only the mob bosses or shady figures he has to cross in order to complete his quest, but the dozens of armed combatants these criminal masterminds have at their disposal. In Chapter 1, the on-screen death count at the hands of Mr. Wick numbers 77. Of those, among the casualties, I think it could be said that at most 10 of them actually had anything to do with the inciting incident. You have Yosef, who orders the dog's death, the henchman that actually kills the dog, and Vigo, who decides to use his power and influence to protect his son, even though he can see that decision will lead to his downfall. That's 3 people, and the other 7 I just chalked up to henchmen who were perhaps in the room or house of John when his puppy was murdered, who stood by and did nothing. My point in bringing this up is to make it understood that the vast majority of the people brutally murdered in this film are people who have no connection to the canine homicide, which, I must reiterate, is the entire basis for catharsis the viewer is supposed to experience. When discussing the second film, Mikey Newman creates a rather funny thought experiment. He asks what a brief scene with 2 or 3 henchmen talking about their lives, family, and ambitions amongst one another before a major shooting sequence would do to the way we perceive the ruthless, machine-like brutality that Mr. Wick uses to handily kill them 3 minutes later. Mikey uses this question to then praise the film for remaining so linearly focused on John's backstory and progression as a person, instead of getting bogged down in details that might make it difficult to root for him as a character. I think this line of thinking actually reveals a much more interesting line of inquiry. Are we actually supposed to be rooting for John Wick in these movies? Keanu Reeves is easily able to portray a man desperate to escape a world he himself decided to drag himself back into. But as the protagonist of these films, despite the insistence of the trilogy that this decision doesn't get to go unpunished, the actual way that message manifests is that every once in a while, John Wick gets shot in the gut. To call the protagonist of these movies a bullet sponge would be an understatement. For all the attention to detail concerning the specificity of reloading, cocking, and firing a gun, the realism of gun violence goes out the window when John seems to shrug off several fatal injuries with some simple gauze tape, a wonder drug to dull the pain, and by the second chapter, a bulletproof suit jacket. Is this specific decision in a vacuum upsetting to me? No, not necessarily. It's when the trilogy tries to criticize its protagonist for his decisions that I get the feeling that these films are trying to have its cake and eat it too. I think these movies have the difficult job of weighing the consequences of Mr. Wick's actions while also trying to keep the franchise going. So outright killing him is not an option, especially when concerns about future profit outweigh the need for consistent thematic cohesion. I think there have been films that have been released far before and soon after Chapter 1, which have done a better job at trying to grapple with a main character who exhibits a deeply flawed behavior, while also taking much more consistent but opposite thematic approaches to addressing the meaningful consequences these protagonists should face for their decisions. Let's look at how two similar movies to the John Wick trilogy tackle the same thematic struggles that these films do, but, at least in my opinion, better. For a recent example, I can't think of a movie which better handles a protagonist whose actions lead him to ruin, while also making him a likable character who the audience can't help but want to succeed, than the Safdie brothers' Uncut Gems. A film in which we follow Howard Ratner, a sports gambler and professional jewelry salesman who is very much drawn to the thrill of his hobby. He, however, owes a lot of people a lot of money, and that has everything to do with his careless attitude towards repaying his collected debts. Throughout the course of the movie, we see Howard continually shirk his already established responsibilities to instead seek the highs of gambling, a habit of his to which he is very obviously addicted. Of course, if you've seen the film, you know that his pattern of behavior doesn't go unpunished. The Safdie brothers frequently state in interviews that even though they tried to make Howard a character the audience wants to succeed, his actions had to lead to his demise, otherwise it would be an implicit approval of his self-destructive behavior. In their words, Howard had to die for the movie to come together cohesively at the end. The John Wick trilogy almost had a moment like this in the third chapter. When the adjudicator asks Winston what is to be done with John, who had just helped him fend off a full frontal assault on the Continental, Winston responds, well, obviously he has to die, before shooting him multiple times in the chest. Of course, even after all this, John manages to survive, but I couldn't help but think that had he died right then and there, it likely would have been a more fitting end than however the series will eventually decide to conclude itself. If the films are going to go on and on about how John is the cause of his own despair, it'd be nice if that actually manifested in permanent, irrevocable harm being inflicted, or the film could toss that specific thematic focus and instead attempt to tell a compelling success story of a criminally entangled protagonist who succeeds in escaping that life only after he takes matters into his own hands. Michael Mann's 1981 feature Thief showcases a film more interested in delivering a satisfying and audience-pleasing conclusion than attempting to morally grandstand about the effects of being so intertwined with a criminal underground not liable to the rules and laws of everyday society. Frank is a jewel thief offered one last big score by an admirer of his work, and in an effort to finally achieve his dream of starting a family with the woman he fancies, decides to take it. After completing the task, he isn't paid in the way previously agreed upon, and is even recruited for a future heist without his knowledge. He obviously doesn't take kindly to this and refuses to work on any more heists, and insists he's paid his previously agreed upon sum within 24 hours. Frank realizes that this decision of his will cost him the comfortable, crime-free life he sought before, and takes efforts to protect his love interest and adopted son by sending them far away from any potential conflict certain to come to Frank's door any day now. At this point, with nothing left to lose, he takes to exterminating the criminal organization which seeks to entrap him in the hopes of escape. By the end of this movie, Frank actually succeeds in this task, with only a gunshot wound or two as penance. Instead of attempting to try to balance punishing a character for their actions while also making their actions relatable and engaging for the sake of some thematic challenge against the institution of violence, the film instead decides to tell a satisfying self-contained story which concludes with the character of whom he experienced the whole movie getting his way more or less. The John Wick trilogy exists in a complicated space where narratively the films are trying to communicate the message that the lifestyle its protagonist engages in is an unhealthy one, while the cinematography makes his lifestyle look as cool and as badass as possible. As I've been writing this video, I've had to ask myself multiple times if my take on these films was even worth putting out into the ether, because every video on John Wick that I've encountered has cited the immaculately well-lit and choreographed murder dungeon sequences as part of the appeal of these movies. I view the lifeblood of this trilogy, the aspect of these films that literally everyone enjoys, as a problem. I think that making John suffer because of the decisions he makes in these movies is a clever one. I just fail to see how the occasional gunshot wound actually denotes the trilogy punishing John for his actions, if it doesn't affect his ability to paint his surroundings red with the blood of his enemies. These films at once attempt to glorify violent lifestyles, while also trying to criticize them. The whiplash that I felt watching Mr. Wick meticulously gouge the eye out of a henchman in Parabellum, only to be expected to, by the end of the film, want John to survive his unexpected gunshot wounds was difficult to stomach. I think the culture of death and bloodshed promoted as a badass lifestyle by these films is an unsustainable one, and the trilogy seems to agree with me, but again, I just feel that they don't go as far as they should in terms of punishing John for perpetuating this culture of violence. Now, what does this have to do with video games and real-world violence? Well, whenever I seek out other takes about these films, I see the comparison to video games being brought up a great deal. John Wick exists in a similar space to that of the player character in franchises like Call of Duty or Medal of Honor, someone who mows down wave after wave of constant faceless foe in order to achieve some goal that is supposedly greater than oneself. In COD or Medal of Honor, the greater purpose to the player's actions is one of a fictionalized patriotism. In John Wick, the greater purpose our protagonist strives for is escape from the cycle of murder, which he seems inextricably linked. But in both cases, the method of achieving their goals is through violence. To bring up the question from the beginning of the video, does violent media cause real-world violence? To that question, my answer remains a stalwart no. But I think the debate around such topics ignores more interesting questions by means of not having to interrogate whether the persistence of violence in media is a necessarily healthy landscape for future generations to grow accustomed to. The fact that movies like those in the John Wick trilogy are just a small part of a greater cultural fixation on violence means that perhaps these films are worth the thematic examination concerning their portrayal of such subject matters. Does this mean that the John Wick movies are bad or harmful to society because they make killing look cool? Obviously not. But I think talking about how the trilogy exists in a greater cultural context of violence is at least worth exploring. My take on John Wick, I must once again note, is an uncommon one. Most people love these movies, and I think there's good reason for that. What other folks look for out of this trilogy is simply not what I look for out of media in general, and that's okay. So if my approach to discussing these films bothers you, might I suggest the series that Movies with Mikey has been updating as the franchise has continued. His videos tend to skew much more positively when it comes to these films, so if my video has bummed you out, please, I can't recommend Mikey Newman enough. Anyways, with that out of the way, please leave your constructive criticism in the comments. And I wish you all a good day in the meantime.